Hello and blessings, beautiful souls. My name is Avalon Cameron and you are at So Below. Now, as you can see, I'm in very good company here on stage. The rose amongst, well, other roses. And I have here my beautiful neighbour and kind of like the dark prince of modern chaos magic.
Alcestis, I will find you.
And I have my new friend, Austin Coppock, who is a mage amongst the stars. Thank you. Now some formalities before we officially begin. The bar is there. Can you all follow my finger? Yes. The toilets are through that door and to your left they are unisex. There are helpers floating around, so just eye contact, one of the most intense looking of occult people, and that's our people. And other than that, before I formally begin, I feel I must acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of this land upon which we stand. We give them our deepest respect. Thank you for having us.
Oh, and the hashtag, obviously, is So Below. So you can please feel free to take pictures and all that kind of stuff. It's fun.
Yes.
I thought you would remember that, Instagram girl.
Don't tease me on stage. All right, let's take it away. So, as Gordon just said, grab out your electronic devices and film as much as you like, share as much as you like, retweet, do the things, okay? It's really, it's a way of sharing what it is that we are offering here today, and I do believe that what we are offering is incredibly important, unique, and 100% original. So, thank you in advance for supporting us.
I think that's it for the beginning. Let's have some space talk.
And thank you retroactively for buying tickets.
Yeah, of course. Yes, welcome.
Rightio, folks. So I'm kind of the MC here, so I'm going to do my absolute best because my profession is a YouTuber and I'm pretty used to talking to a camera. You're intimidating the fuck out of me right now. So thanks for being here. Supportive awws would be all right, okay? Excellent crowd, yes. Right, so we're going to start off this Star Talk with a basic one, yet a basic one with a complicated answer. So, which one of you lovely gentlemen would like to tell us exactly how old astrology is?
I think probably me. All right, so first we have to break that question up, or we have to define what do we mean by astrology. And so if we're talking about the recognizable art of casting a chart for the moment that a person is born or a city is founded, things like this, where we divide into houses and signs, and we look at the geometrical relationships between the planets and their configuration of the stars, that right now the evidence is 1st century BC. However, it's already rather perfectly formed at that point, which tells us, which leads us to think that either somebody invented in one night and then it was perfectly formed, rather unlikely, or that we don't have documents from earlier. But that's where we start seeing recognizable birth charts. That's where the earliest texts, and this is in the Eastern Mediterranean for the most part. And that's partially because the Eastern Mediterranean cultural sphere has been the subject of more attention and research than some other areas. I think we'll probably find lots of new clues and facts as the research continues. But if we're talking about astrology as a conscious recognition of the relationship between earthly and human affairs and the configuration of the heavens, and acting in accordance with that, or timing things in accordance with that, then we see evidence of that in our earliest surviving Stone Age. Do people still use the term Stone Age, Gordon?
Yeah.
All right, but we see that we see that in the earliest possible human artifacts, and so that if astrology proper is in a sense a subset of the attempt to understand the relationship between humans, time, and sky, then we've been doing that as long as we've been doing it.
Yeah, we and obviously I get to pick it up there, and I get to do I'm going to break it into two as well, and mine go back even further, and that's absolutely correct. Astrology in the 1st century BC is a remarkable fulfillment of something that humans appear to do spontaneously. It's how we exist and think about and make meaning in our lives on planet with everything else that's off planet, and that is there baked into the earliest cave paintings, as in literally the earliest that we've recently found in island Southeast Asia that are 42,000 years old. You look at the placement of some of the animals, and I'm not saying it's a zodiac, obviously, but you have that kind of story over you in stone, and you can kind of look at that and go, I think I know what they're doing there. And obviously you get into the Paleolithic, and this idea of what this means is how we think about time before we had watches, and that appears to be one of the first things we do. That's my first bit. I break it into the second, which is we have absolutely no credible materialist reason for how life spontaneously emerged on this planet, because it didn't. So life on Earth is off planet, like we are the aliens. So how big is astrology and how old is astrology? We're from astrology. Like life on Earth, it is extremely likely came from space in the form of viruses and mushy rocks and so on. So is that astrology? Is that our relationship to, is that our on-planet, off-planet relationship at its inception? So maybe everything's astrology.
Perhaps that's so. I would like to know, however, if you could break it down just a little bit further. So I'm sure, could I just see a quick show of hands of how many people here are competent in astrology? Oh, hi.
Put your hand up.
How many are trying to become competent in astrology?
Yes.
Okay.
And so,
astrologers are humble.
I would like to know what it is that, well, when you are beginning to learn astrology for the first time, what are you looking at first? Like this basic tropical or, Vedic astrology, is that what you see first? And how does Hellenistic astrology then come into play with all of this? Are there sections of astrology? Is there the astrological age chart?
So what I would say, having learned astrology, or learned some astrology, and having known a bunch of people who've learned some astrology, and having tried to teach astrology, that there are a variety of angles in, and there are, the way that I think of the teaching metaphor that I often use is that of a clock, either a watch or maybe a more like Saturnian grandfather clock, where it won't tell time until you have all of the gears interconnected, but you have to forge each of the gears separately. And so generally speaking, people learn about the significations of the planets, the powers of the planets first. Well, generally in a formal curriculum, but the way a lot of people come to astrology is they learn the characteristics of the signs through the sort of pop stuff, right? You're a Pisces, you lost your wallet, or you're going to lose your wallet this week, right? Which is unfortunately, I am an unfortunate Pisces cliche in a sense like that. I almost left my phone on a garden an hour south.
Yeah, Heron's Wood. It's been quite the Mercury week.
Yes, it has. And anyway, but so let me pause and answer your question again. So there are a variety of angles in the Vedic astrology or Jyotish, and Hellenistic astrology, and what people call modern astrology, as well as Renaissance astrology, the astrology of the Arabic phase, etc., etc. You have a number of shared elements, and they may be used differently in those different periods of time. But you have a zodiac of some sort as a framework. You have a house system of some sort to sort topics. and then you look at the geometrical relationship of the planets to one another. And so the difference...
It's maths. It's math.
Some of it. Well, it's like, when I was learning, I came to think of it as sort of archetypal calculus. You're doing...
There you go, folks. If you're bad at maths, you're shit out of luck now, okay?
But it's like...
Just know that. Don't try.
It's like imaginal maths. Like...
Yeah. I jump in on the age chart stuff as well and go, this has been one of the historiographic challenges of how you date the age of astrology, because we date it to when people start using planets and houses and zodiacs. But we started with the stars because they were more navigationally useful. And I'm talking 50 to 150,000 years ago. So our relationship with the stars was how we navigated time and place, quite literally how we moved across the planet. And that appears to be this is an oversimplification because you can kind of see Venusian implications in Paleolithic architecture. But it sort of goes stars because they didn't really move, so they're much better for navigation, and the planets do. And then you kind of have a stellar emphasis coming into Egypt and a planetary influence coming through the Near East, Sumer and then Babylon, and then they get their kind of smush in the first few centuries, first century BC and so on. But it kind of goes like stars, interest in planets, smush is kind of where that goes.
Yeah, well, it goes, sun, moon, stars,
yeah.
And
well, we were having this discussion last night, weren't we? For people who are like, I'm not sure if I do astrology, I'm not sure if it's for me, and we're talking in a magical community sense, and I'm like, listen, if you cast a circle, you're doing astrology. If you call the quarters, you're doing astrology. Like, that's
If you think that the moon's phase or position is at all important, right, you're using one piece of astrology.
That's it. That's exactly right. And I think sort of from a modern neo-pagan perspective, we love ourselves the moon, the full moon, the ritual, the new moon, the ritual, the waning moon, the ritual. There's a lot of ritual that is just haphazardly tied to the moon. People don't question why. They just feel that it is right, and so they do it. And so there is definitely a lunar pull of some description. So why wouldn't there be a planetary pull of sorts?
Absolutely. And just to expand on the moon, to continue with the moon, one of the earliest things that it appears that people were doing astrology sort of between the proper chart sense and the super general sense that I mentioned earlier is we have in the Vedas, we have using the position of the moon relative to star clusters to time ritual, right? And so this is what we would call now lunar mansions, right? Lunar mansions are just what, star clusters that the moon moves through or moves near in its travel around and around. And so the early, in a sense, what was the first application of astrology? The first application of astrology appears to have been ritual. Like the divinatory diagram that a chart provides appears to be a much later development, and that's really interesting. One of the things that we can use to date, because once we get past the wonderfully documentable Eastern Mediterranean Greco-Roman era. We know that there are pieces of astrology that are most certainly older than that, but we don't have a thing that we can date and say, yep, right there. And so one of the pieces we can use is, for example, in the oldest documents, in Jyotish or Vedic astrology, we see the lunar mansions beginning from a mansion called Kritika, which is the star cluster that we call the Pleiades. And so this, and there's some other information that suggests that that circle began there because that was the constellation that rose at the vernal equinox where those folks were. And so, the star, in a sense, we're talking about the star-sun relationship. We're talking about the sidereal and tropical relationship. We understand when that relationship occurred that allows us to date things. So that pushes us, that's a dating that pushes us back to about 3000 BC. And that's interesting because that's way earlier than our 100 AD or BC.
3102, Austin and I had this. 3102 BC. I have in my notes here, you called it when the prehistory became history, or when the prehistory of astrology becomes history is in this sort of 5000 BC to 3102 BC, and that's in the earliest Jyotish documents you were talking about, the oldest?
Yes, the oldest that we have.
That is a fascinating map to what we know archaeologically about, again, we're talking Sumer, Babylon on one side and Egypt on the other, right? And if you consider, and I do, and I go to some length at this, that say the Old Kingdom is the fulfillment of the entire Paleolithic project, and then you get your first intermediate period, and then kind of like Egypt, as we understand it, begins, then that's the same time frame. And so when the prehistory becomes history is where we get these indications that there was something in that millennia where we got really good at ritual mapping to the sky in stone and performatively and so on, because as you say, before that, it's really difficult to date things. My favorite one is the Burong people, who consider the night sky, or the stars in the night sky, to be the campfires of their dead ancestors, which is just the most impossibly beautiful idea when you are sitting out on country, especially at a time with no light pollution, and you're by your campfire, and they're right there. But they also use the different rising of constellations to kind of move and meet up with other extended mobs, so they can do the like trading and family catch-up and marriage and so on. So it's literally the ancestors coming with you, ritually and moving across the earth to continue living and living well. So this is like how astrology, in the sense of humans' relationship to the stars, is 50,000 years old, but there is a weird contact point in the 5000 to 3102, and what's eerie about that is because obviously the documents you're talking about aren't that old. It's not like it's a 5,000-year-old text.
There's
right?
lots of argumentation about that.
Sure.
Which, before you go on, I just wanted to drop some more things that land on basically the same date. I was rereading Ben Dyke's collection of classical mundane astrologers, and the Arabic astrologers were talking like 800 to 1,000, mostly AD. When they're doing history, they do a beginning point, which is the flood, right? And that's basically 3000 BC. So like, yes, that's when all of this begins. Like we're moving from there. We know that the big flood didn't happen then, but the location of a start/end date at that time is meaningful, right? And then, there's one more. And that's also when the Kali Yuga begins.
Yeah. There was a minor flood. It flooded up the Gulf Sea. That's like the last death rattle.
Well, and if you had an older flood myth, and then there was another flood, you'd be like, all right, break out the flood myth.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And so, in
case of emergency.
And so I want to literally step a little bit sideways to a point that connects to that, in talking about the age of astrology, right, or how old it is. And so, what's interesting in the Vedic tradition that I've been studying in this year, which is very traditional, the primary text is the Brihad Parashara Horashastra, and Parashara. I'm saying all the wrong. My Sanskrit's still terrible. And there's a lot of discussion about Parashara, right? Because the author of this book, Parashara, the author, was not like a guy who lived in 1200 and we know about his life. He was the grandson of Varuna and the son of an immortal sage. And I remember on, I think, day 2 of class, I asked the teacher, I was like, okay, well, so I want to align myself with learning in this stream. Should I include Parashara in my monthly ancestor feeding? And he was like, oh God, no! Don't treat him like he's a dead guy. Treat him like he's divine. And so, kind of, this is interesting to me because it's pinging the mythical or legendary founders of astrology from further west, which I'm familiar with. Right? We have for those who aren't familiar with it, all of the Greco-Roman, Eastern Mediterranean texts in astrology, the Hellenistic astrology texts, they all point back at this tag team named Nichepso and Petasiris, who are said to be an Egyptian king and priest who worked together to astrology, right? And we don't have the Nichepso Petasiris text, and people have looked over the records of high priests and kings, and there's not really a good match, right? So this is at least 2/3 legendary. And then we have the ascription of texts and arts and sciences, such as astrology, to Hermes, which is another sort of not Hermes, the god with wings on his on his hat and shoes and such, but this sort of culture hero, the civilizing trickster, if you will, who brought the science. And so what's interesting is there are a number of things in the Parashara text that date him to, like, the like sort of traditional answer within the lineage that I was given was, oh yeah, Parashara was alive, 3102 BC, and that's where this comes from. And that doesn't need to be literally true to be interesting.
It's something kind of true, because I get to say, I'm not saying it's aliens, right? But
he's saying it's aliens.
So Robert Temple, who famously wrote the Sirius Mystery, calls that 5000 to 3000 BC some sort of contact era. Now, his whole angle is that it's actually people or aliens from Sirius B. It's probably not that, right? But what you actually have is other people looking at, and he's a genius. I've spoken to him a couple of times. He's just wrong. What you have there is the same kind of, like, what an unusual shape for that little corner of the world in Egypt and Sumer over that same period that has this. So it's kind of true, like this sort of age of heroes looks to someone like Robert Temple as a contact era, because it's this anomalous update almost in how we organize culture and architecture when it comes to sky ground.
Right, one that relates to how a lot of knowledge was treated during that and subsequent eras, as well as more specifically how astrological knowledge was treated, which was as received or revealed rather than invented. And if there was a period where people got some big downloads, and maybe from identifiable entities, maybe not, but whatever, they got some big downloads, and then the satellite tower broke, then you need to preserve that knowledge as long as possible. You're going to have that kind of attitude towards it, rather than sort of I don't know, like a disrupt technological attitude, right? We can make it better.
Interesting. Now, this is a lot. It's a lot, isn't it? There's a lot here, and you're probably understanding 15% like myself. But what I would like to say is that you will have an opportunity to put your hand up and ask those really poignant questions, because I know that you're thinking very hard about it now and it's brewing away in your head. Now, what I would like for you to do is articulate your questions very nicely, hold on to them and ask them at the end when I give you the wave to do so. It's also important to not ask personal chart questions, because it is impossible for these gentlemen to answer that.
I'll answer it, but I will be so wrong, and you will.
Find him when he is drunk later and ask him then. Right, so I would like to... Oh gosh, you said so many good things. I've got so many questions in my head. You said revealed religions, and then I thought to myself, non-revealed religions. So is it just the revealed religion peoples that got these texts and then really understood astrology? What about all the like dirty low magicians that just live in contact with the earth?
It was their religion.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not talking about the people of the book. There's sort of an intersection, sometimes incidental intersection, between astrology and all sorts of other traditions. But there were people who thought of themselves as hermeticists, and in a sense, it was a religion religion is even a great term for it. But it was a quote-unquote religion of knowledge, right? Like, there were the sacred sciences or arts. You went to church by learning, performing, calculating astrology, alchemy, performing magic, thurgy, thaumaturgy, right? So, it is the religion of the dirty sorcerers.
Yeah.
And the clean sorcerers, too.
Astrology, sometimes I think of it as, if you consider its history, and I would include, say, how we got Hermeticism. I know Aaron Sheik's in the room, and he's got a great book about this, and the rise of Hermeticism in terms of like creating materia is a miniaturization of the dynastic temple tech, where you actually install gods and things, right? And it just seems to me that astrology is like somebody standing at the top of a staircase holding like a box of knives, and then falls down the stairs, and the knives go everywhere because it's had so many hits. It's had to run through. We've talked about this. We'll get to it at the end. Like it touches into religions where it can kind of get co-opted. Neoplatonism kind of works and kind of doesn't. Like all these things have happened to it through the course of, particularly even just from the 1st century BC. It's funny that it's still here, and we're in this stage now in the last 10 or so years where we can maybe start patching some of the damage from falling downstairs holding a bunch of knives.
Well, and also just mapping the trajectory of the bounces down the stairs.
It becomes, this is why we started with the history stuff, right? It becomes so much more beautiful. I mean, it's already elegant, but it becomes so much more beautiful when you can contextualize it in the longer stream of human history, and in my case, planetary history, because seriously, life came from space. So consider what that's like. Yeah. Consider what I just find that really enriching and compelling to be in that kind of much longer historical current.
Well, it gives you an idea of astrology as a creature.
Yes.
Right. Like astrology is a durable creature, a durable, adaptable creature. Because, yeah.
It's a beast as well if you don't understand it, and I think that's really a very, very important thing for you both to understand, that not everybody speaks astrology here. You're speaking like some hardcore astrology. So how can astrology be jailbroken to be more approachable or easily digested, to work a bit closer with it, so that the average mystic, witch, occultist, what have you, can apply it directly to their practice, directly to their charts? How can they make that happen for themselves? How can they get there? Like, what route would you recommend?
If they're already doing magic, start with the grimoires, right? Because you
Which
have...
ones?
Oh, it doesn't matter. I have a preference, but like, let's just say, we'll just use a classic Key of Solomon, right? So there is a timing method if you were going to essentially summon a spirit, right? And that is literally astrology. It's lunar focused. The steps are basically make sure the moon isn't shit, step 1, lunar day, and then get your planetary days and hours right. And so you're doing the kind of timing you specifically need to summon that particular kind of spirit. So I would start there, because there are, like, you can widen it out, and it's quite a good, thinking about it, we had this discussion the other day, it's quite a good jailbreak, frankly. It's a good enough system of timing to call up a spirit. If you do worse than that, probably nothing's going to happen. And you can risk doing better than that, / more complicated than that, and then you get caught in, you have electional dysfunction. Situational electional dysfunction.
Yeah.
That's the second dick joke on stage.
That comes at the end.
Yeah. What would you care to add to what I just said about, I think if you're doing magic and it comes to getting better at astrology, maybe a good place to start is that, or even just lunar days.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what you're saying is perfect. You're already using timing systems which are astrological. When we're talking about astrology proper, in a sense what we're doing is we're taking 10 different timing systems, putting them all on top of each other, and then looking at things through those 10 lenses at once. But each one of those lenses tells us something, right? Like planetary days and hours has been part of astrological timing since our earliest texts, and therefore probably before our earliest texts. And so if you use planetary days and hours, get to know planetary days and hours, understand the logic by which they are constructed and allocated. And also, one thing that I recommend for people who are interested in learning astrology, or just getting to be able to feel the difference between different planets being dominant during a period of time, whether it's a day or an hour or whatever, is just leave that app open on your phone and just take note when the planetary hour changes, right? And planetary hours are such a non-abstract system in the sense that you can just watch the day go by and you can watch things change as the planetary hour changes. For example, the hour of Saturn always follows the hour of the moon. A lot of times you'll see people kind of get a little hungry or uncomfortable during the hour of the moon, and then they're kind of dull and down and maybe a little anxious during the hour of Saturn, and then the hour of Jupiter follows and people perk up. And it's just something that happens. Also, you know, I have a friend who I've known for 20 years, but has kind of come late to this material. It's sort of like, oh, what you've been doing the whole time, it's been real the whole time, huh? And it's like, yeah, good job. Better late than never, right? And he just started paying attention, just on his phone, just a little app. He was like, oh, dude, the deal went through in the hour of Mercury, which is interesting because we made that deal yesterday during the hour of Mercury, and you told me Mercury was in a good condition during this period of time. And so things happened during the hour of Mercury, right? And then, for example, he got hit pretty hard by this Venus retrograde that we are just now getting done with. And so what he noticed was that Friday, the day of Venus, at work there were a lot of weird social dynamics. Like all of the bad feelings that people have about their coworkers came out, and it happened, you know, about 4, 5, 6 Fridays in a row. And he was just like, okay, going into Friday, he was like, all right, it's going to be a Venus retro Friday. Like, set course for that, be ready to adapt.
Very well, but how does one access this timing information if you, like me, have ever scoured the internet for credible astrological information? You will have noticed that each page is so fucking different one from the other, and there is sections that are across the board, yes, they are true, and then there are some that are just, well, how do you get that information? How do you get concrete timing information that a person could just have on their phone?
Let's see. Well, well, there are several people in this room who will give you reliable information. But what I would say is go to the source. Like, just look. Like, it doesn't take. You know, you can become familiar with the basic significations of the planets in 2 hours, right? It's not there. There are archetypal principles that are already installed and active in you and everyone you've ever met, and so you will recognize them. And so with something like planetary hours, which there aren't like 30 competing schools as to how to divide the day into planetary hours. You can just tell your phone to tell you which planetary hour it is. There are a million free apps out there. And then you can watch. You know, the best astrological education comes from watching time through a particular structure and seeing how it works.
And I think that's halfway to magic, because it's true, because it's a discussion that's I go round and round in my head with, which is your friend, right? Venus retro at work. Did that happen to him? And what I've landed on is you get more of an effect if you're aware of it, which means generally you get higher highs and higher lows rather than rolling with the system. So it's accidentally magic to begin to pay like half attention to something like planetary days and lunar days, even like just start with basic things, because if you pay attention to it, you will notice it more, and you may even consciously or unconsciously lean into it. And I find that, because the thing is, it can't be as simple as, well, if you're focusing on it, of course, it's going to make more sense to you, because like it works. This was 10 years ago, the same thing with your friend. I'm like, oh god damn it, this actually works. Like I have to do something about this. And we have all these new data. Like the Soviets were oddly so much better at this. They did what Avalon did, right? So they actually noticed particular configurations and started a massive data compilation of like things that happened at certain times, and there were like reliable-ish signals in it. So they actually did the Babylon kind of thing of observing the heavens and seeing what happened in the world and seeing if that comes back around again. So it's not as simple as if you are aware of it, you'll notice it more. Like that is clearly psychologically true. But the other thing is it works. And so it's accidentally magic to even just keep your eye on planetary days. It just kind of plan things. You plan your life around planetary days. If you're going to plant something, if you're going to go on a date, if you're going to do whatever, just give it that little edge, and why not? It's free.
That's it. I like the idea of observation of timing, and I think that that's accessible, very accessible. But what I would like to know from an occult practitioner point of view is what kind of magic can I weave in accordance with this knowledge of timing? What kind of woo-woo juju work? Hexing.
What kind of woo-woo do you do?
Give us the hard stuff.
Well, actually, this was the kind of inspiration for the talk, frankly, because Austin and I chat fairly often, and inside the magic world, there is a general uneasiness with getting to, and I mean, I'm not good at this, like a baseline competency at astrology, because you do kind of need some of it for evocation and conjuration and so on. And those on the astrological side, these are all broad strokes, right? Who do magic may somehow... The risk is that we conflate astrological magic to the creation of talismans. And then there's the magic guys over here, not kind of like looking askance at astrology, but still doing the timing. And it seemed like this was the blend, because it's a really good question. What can you do with this stuff?
Well, you said talismans, right? And if you were to type in talisman in Dr. Google, Granny Google as I like to call it, she's lovely, then what you're going to find is several different examples, not all which are tied to astrology and or timing. So, what are you talking about? Like, what talisman are you talking about? Explain talisman to me in this context.
I'll let Austin do that, but first I will foreshadow that by saying, when Austin mentioned there wasn't specifically, there aren't like variations of planetary days and hours. Like, we have one of them. That is generally not the case with star magic theory, for want of a better term. And there's some really fascinating speculation as to why this might be so. Dr. Stephen Skinner, when he looks at the earliest version of the Key of Solomon is the Hygromantia. It's my favorite, and he kind of thinks, and it's based on his time in China, that in China, if you don't get the right hours correctly, you don't acknowledge the spirit governing the hour, you're not initiated, and they don't have to do shit for you. And he has this possibility that it was deliberately scrambled because you're in this situation of trying to keep certain parts of texts and practices alive in the kind of emerging Byzantine Christianity. And he's just got this, it's possible that it was taken out and designed and is somewhere else, which we will never find. This precision timing. Same thing happened with the spirit lists further up the story of the Grimoires, right? There's a bit of a car crash. So we know that if you go back to dynastic Egypt and Babylon to some extent, their timing game was off the charts good. And then we have a car crash where it's a bit scrambled, and then it starts to move, and you have and this is where we get to the Austin bit, like we have the Iranian and Moorish Spain stuff, and then that mutates again once it hits Europe and the Grimoires, but it also has a sort of technical hermetica into herbalism line as well. So it's a split. When you say what are talismans, or what is like the talisman theory, there probably was one. I mean, it's really romantic to think of it. There probably was one, but we're dealing with the crashed flying saucer rather than the operating one.
Right. So talismans generally are things that hold magical power and distort reality around them in accordance with that magical power, right? So they're magic items.
How is that different to a charm?
With the definition that we're using for talisman, charm would be a type of talisman. So just on the broadest sense, we're talking about magic things, right? And a magic thing shapes events and people around it to fit the nature of its power, right?
Understood.
And so what appears to be, we might say, the height, or at least the most technically complicated and, in my experience, powerful method of astrological magic is the creation of talismans. And this is detailed most extensively in the Picatrix, or the Gayat al-Hakim, right? And the Picatrix is The author is unknown, although he's referred to as the Sage Picatrix, but we don't really know. And it's like it's 11th century, and it's from Haran. And Haran is a very interesting place that no longer exists. Basically, right, using modern day borders, it'd be border of Syria and Turkey. And what was remarkable, and so it was near the edge of the Caliphates and the Byzantine Empire, right? And what's really interesting about it is that the official religion of Haran was Hermeticism for some time during the Caliphate period. They paid the heretic tax, which didn't always work. But what was interesting about it is you had them celebrating seasonal rituals such as the ritual death of Tammuz or Tammuz up until the 12th century. And so you have this old Mesopotamian underlay rather than overlay, right? Which is very planet, star, human magic. That's, as far as ancient cultures, they seem to have specialized in that. And then you have layered onto that a great number of refugees from the Roman Empire and then the Byzantine Empire who brought Platonism, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism. They brought the technical astrology and the technical Hermetica. And so you have a very strange, very potent cauldron for doing astromagics. And so, the Picatrix is basically the big book of astrological magic, and it's straight out of Haran, right? And so the theory there, and what's nice is the book is actually, so like many earlier books, it's, in this book it says this, there are, I think something like 200 different books are cited, but the author actually gives you a lot of philosophical and theoretical connector pieces. And the art is bringing together the right material with the right ritual at the right time, with the celestial configuration being what it is, to bring a planetary or stellar power down into a thing and have it live there. So instead of a configuration, giving you a really nice weekend, you have the really nice weekend talisman, right? That's there forever. You're calling that spirit, we can call it a celestial spirit, down into stone.
Okay.
And
so it is forever imbued in the talisman.
Yes, scratched into it. And there's actually, just as far as the technique goes, there's a big emphasis on marking the material with the images that the stars and planets respond to. You're literally carving the power into the hardest things you can find. Usually it's stone, there's also metal, and the Picatrix will offhand say, yeah, you can probably use bone, if it's from an appropriate animal, like if we're talking about Saturn, you could probably do a goat bone talisman. I probably will do a goat bone.
Nice.
That sounds magnificent.
This, one of the things, when we were trying to arrange how we talk about magic and astrology and astrological magic at the one time, and blend this together, is there's some sort of best practice, at least I think, when it comes to talismans, which is very similar to the sort of Solomonic sequence, which is do it correctly or do something completely different. So there are other things you can do with timing, right?
That's right.
Yeah, but don't, the thing, and it's the same with just generally magic, well, the world of magic in general, at least in the West, is we've inherited this mid-20th century, don't have any frankincense, use cumin. As if it's some sort of grandmother's recipe situation. These things, it works, and it appears to have a structure. So when we talk about how you use talismans or what are talismans, when it comes to the Picatrix, do it right or do something else for that election. And I think, and there's so many other things you could do, I think people fall into the trap of kind of making something low resolution that is designed to be a specific way or it won't work. And then go, no, that didn't really work. And I'm like, well, did you use lead? What did you use? Paper,
Yeah, well, just on that note, I was doing experiments with the Picatrix as soon as I got it. I think I've shared this before, but Before it was fully translated into English, there was one half of it was translated by Ouroboros Press, and the first time I met the the publisher, we'd gone back and forth on MySpace. That's how long ago this was. And I was swinging through Seattle, and we had he bought me a nice Indian lunch, and we hung out in the park and talked. And he put the half of the Picatrix that had been published at that point, he placed it in my hand and said, "I think you'll know what to do with this," which is a comment that's aged well.
And I mean, so I experiment with, because I don't know how to carve things into gold. I'm sorry. That's actually why I befriend the Coppocks, right? This if I want know when you're beaten. But there are other things you can do with the timing, and sometimes they don't work either. I had a very hilarious January, my first month on the farm, because lunar days work quite well for organizing your life. Like especially if you live somewhere agrarian where you actually have fishermen and orchardists and merchants and so on, because you look at the list and go, this is a good day to go to sea, or what have you. Like, it's a pretty surprisingly good match for living in the Huon Valley. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try the lunar mansions. I'm going to try to run my life on the lunar mansions. And I was like, don't do that. And I'm like, no, I'm doing it. And it was garbage. It was nothing happened. It was nothing but bad happened. No uplift happened, and that's clearly not what lunar mansions are for. And I had all of January to work that out, and I can tell you confidently, you can run your life on lunar days, but not mansions.
Let me give you a better reference.
A better reference than my hilarious first month on the farm.
Yeah. Well, no. I don't have much confidence in the document that you were working with.
What was the document?
I don't know.
Come on.
It was like this crazy half
photographic
theosophical 1921 thing. It was an amazing compilation for its time period.
Yeah.
But I would not have. We'll run that again.
You're telling me this coming January I can repeat the lunar mansion?
No, January is going to be a shit show anyway. Let's get a more useful month.
All right. Well,
Why? We need to know. You can't make statements like that if we can't use them. We need to access that information.
Everyone in this room can help you out with that. This is almost a personal chart question, frankly.
So we start a new sequence of eclipses, half of which take place right next to Saturn in Capricorn, and with Pluto there. And it signifies January will be an excellent introduction to what will suck about the next 2 years.
Oh, okay. There you go. Congratulations. Now you know.
Staying with talismans, because this is a question I want to see if we can extract the conversation.
Yeah, I got a few more things. What I was leading to earlier, when I was told the Kiesel story, is I started working out of the Picatrix before I even had the second half, right? And I did I think the first thing I did was like a notebook paper in a spirit pot. Like, I was just making shit up, but it worked great. And so I was doing experiments and kind of learning through trial and error. And I remember the first time that I partnered with somebody who actually knew how to work with metals and stones, the notorious Tony Mack. And this is, I think, early 2010. And we did something in solid gold. And we synchronized swatches, and he was working in Pennsylvania, and I was doing my part in Los Angeles, and so that was also an experiment. Can we coordinate an operation that way? And then when we got the package in the mail, I opened it, and just seeing it was blown away, like the wave of power that was emanating from it. I was like, oh, gold is better than notebook paper. Like, this isn't just like a fancy man's suggestion. And I was like, okay, materials have power. It's not just the stars.
And that's where I was going to go. Like, why? Like, how might we think about talismans? You mentioned the Picatrix description, which is you kind of get a celestial spirit to come and dwell in a material object. But in light of sort of the appearance of new Vedic understandings and new classical understandings, are there better ways of thinking with talisman metaphysics in the end of 2018?
So something that occurs to me just as you say that is that talisman is something that exists at a greater density than the other material objects. Like it's just as a physical object's mass will distort the space around it. If you have intelligence changes the space around it. Desire changes the space around it, and the more desire, the more intelligence, the more spirit that a person possesses. It warps reality to fit their quality. And so, a talisman, my experience of astrological talismans is that they warp the space around them because they're heavier on more levels. Does that make sense?
It does, because where I was going with that, I think in my head, maybe it's what I'm trying to get towards. What I mentioned before, and this is actually bringing it back to the quote-unquote down and dirty Huon Valley magic, is basically, when you look at a document, when you look at, say, the Quirinides, right, which is this fascinating kind of like Greek medical text, for the love of God, do not use any of the treatments that are in it. But essentially you get like a bird and a fish and a rock and a plant, and each one for a letter of the Greek alphabet. And it's sort of Kabbalistic in the sense that you arrange them for different things, which we don't really know how to do. Some we can, but it's all kind of governed in the structure. And it's weird, right? So there will be just occasionally little throwaway comments in the text where it'll be some sort of Venusian uplift, like an erectile dysfunction or something. And at the bottom of like here, eat this gallbladder and have this stone and what have you. So just plant like a cypress tree on the southwest corner of your house, just like a little bit at the side that isn't really in the document, and you just get these glimpses of that third line, that technical Hermetica line, coming through that shows that we used to have an understanding of the differing interiority of the material world, and we used to have a language for it, and like we're right there with talisman theory and all these kind of new texts, well, recently available, actually quite old texts, where just it feels to me like we used to have this language of interiority, and that's kind of why I don't like the Picatrixine one, because by then matter is empty and you kind of bring a spirit down into it, and that's not because it's sort of post the Platonic influence. Mm-hmm. And what if we think about it from that sort of implied technical Hermetica perspective, what we get to do is line it up next to non-Western or non-Platonic cultures is a better way of thinking about it. Amazonian cultures, Aboriginal cultures, Chinese cultures, what have you, where there's a kind of more a more nuanced understanding of what matter is, because then we start to think what you're saying, them being heavier and more there, right? That's kind of where I'm going with it. Like, what if we think in those sideways directions? Because coming back, especially for us who grow things, right?
Yes. And who don't have access to oodles of gold.
Yeah. Well, we could start a mine, let's be honest. But what we can do is, if we start thinking about it from an interiority of matter perspective, because we have places to plant trees and herbs and so on. So it's about sliding a technical Hermetica metaphysics underneath the absolute practice, like the precision practice of texts like the Picatrix, and then going, well, this is what I mean by do the talismans right, or do something completely different with the election, like plant a bay tree on the exact right time, and it's not a talisman, but it is something.
That's exactly right. So we know that botanical matter, trees, plants, petals, of which I have falling out of me right now. White roses is what I wore inside me today. We know that there is astrological information attached to these. If you've read even a basic Cunningham book, you will know that a plant is given a gender and also it's given a planet. And there is your little taste test of that at a very, very basic level, attached to something as available to everyone as nature. And I think it's really important to make it available. Again, I don't have a lot of gold on me, or lead, or metals, but the idea seems absolutely fascinating to be able to draw down that beautiful spirit energy. But why can't I do that with a tree?
I wouldn't even call it drawing down. From my experience of it, having just spent the last year, like you, actually playing with these timing and planting methods, is that they become brighter in your awareness when it's their day. So there is the right day to plant and harvest rosemary. And that's what I mean by the technical Hermetica metaphysics allows for it to look more like non-Western cultures where there is a day and an interaction with the plant as person, and it's already there. It's just that at different times it's brighter in reality or in one's awareness. And that's what a talisman does, right? Like you actually like seal that moment of a particular brightness. But it happens with... I'm trying to find a horizontal language so that we can, instead of half-assing talismans with paper, we recognize talismans for the vigorous and highly effective thing that they are as one instance of astrological magic, but begin to explore the language of how else that can be. And it just, that's the bit that I would like to solve in the medium term, is how we kind of get over modifying talismans as essentially what astrological magic is.
Yeah. Well,
sorry, the other camera is, I think it's still recording, but like, just the screen's off. Would you be able to check it again?
All right. That one's still going then?
It's still going, yeah.
all right, so
3 recording devices, Mercury retrograde.
They're all new. They're all new.
Yeah, Avalon and I have the same camera. We've had them for like 3 weeks, so
It's what neighbours do.
we don't know what we're doing. Yeah.
well, and so in order to accomplish what you were talking about, Gordon, I think that involves rethinking or just thinking more deeply about the chain of being ideas.
Sure.
Right, where we have, there's a face of the divine that corresponds with a planet, and that planet then corresponds with types of animals and types of humans and types of plants and types of stones and types of metals, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's easy, probably because they're presented in books this way, to just look at it as a list and you memorize all the things on the list. What's arisen out of my practice and feels like a slightly more organic and maybe more accurate way of thinking about it is who's feeding what. The idea that a plant is fed by a particular planet and it brightens when it's fed. That's its time. That the quote unquote children of the planets are fed by that planet, and the condition of the parent changes the condition of the child. Planets are said to be fed by the light of certain stars, that being very obviously the case with the planets in our solar system all being literally fed constantly by our sun. And another thing that, again, is just sort of incidental or just emergent from doing talismans and astrological magic is, in addition, so in most astrological magic, especially talismans, part of the ceremonial portion is the hey you, hey Jupiter, I know you, here are your qualities, you're doing this, you're known by these names, and pulling all that down by means of address. And so what I started doing a couple years ago, and seemed right, so I kept doing it, was addressing the material as well, right? Like, hey, silver, wake up, right? Open up, it's time to do this. It's very much making a sandwich. You're uniting heaven and earth, rather than dropping something animate into something inanimate, right? You're fusing two intelligences, or you're fusing two matters of varying degrees of subtlety.
Hang on. Is that good? Because that actually got it down to back to the down and dirty magic, right? Which is addressing material as a component, which I really like. In my experience, what you were saying about different things in various kingdoms being children of the stars is literally how it's felt over the year, where they've been brighter in my attention on certain days, and that's what I mean. There's a lot we can do with timing, right?
Well, and that's and again, one of the things I know that you were laboring to differentiate is all the timing value of astrology to magic from astrological talismans, which are a very specific thing. And so, one great example of plants and timing is the Thessalos document that Dimitra George recently wrote a piece on that's in the Celestial Art. So I don't know if you got to this, Avalon, but so it's in the Celestial Art, and basically it's a Hellenistic Roman era document where Thessalos wants to be a famous doctor, and he goes down to Egypt, and he learns all the plants, and he learns their various qualities and whatnot. And he's going to make miraculous medicines. And he writes back to mom and dad, says, get ready for me. And he goes back home to Greece, and he does the recipes, and nothing fucking works. And so he's like, oh, God damn it. And so he does a pilgrimage to the temple of Asclepius and does a dream incubation to try to find the answer. Oh God of healing, why is my healing suck? And Asclepius appears to him and says, well, you got the timing wrong, stupid. Like, you need to harvest, these are the right plants, you just need to harvest them at these points so that they have the potency that they're supposed to. And so this is like a received this is sort of a story of received knowledge that's then part of, basically a medical botanical from that era. Mm-hmm. And so that's, and he doesn't need to be a great astrologer for that. It was like, yeah, harvest it during this month when the moon is waxing. Right? It doesn't require all the wheels and gears. Just one, just 1.5 gears.
Okay, that makes it a little bit more accessible, I suppose.
So, let's stay on that for a minute in terms of, obviously the harvesting thing makes sense, but when it comes to doing this, how much of an eye should you have on your own chart? Do you know what I mean? Because some people have, say, a poorly aspected Mars, either natally or right now, and you're trying to harvest peppers, or tobacco, right? So what should you, is the space weather at the time more important than your natal? What do you think?
Well, I would say that it depends on the type of operation. If we're talking about just harvesting a plant,
probably
at the time that it's most potent, there you go. You might find that once you learn the astrological correspondences of plants, and you get a sense of which planets in your chart are kicking ass and which ones are not, you may find that you really like the plants that correspond to the planets that are in good shape. And you might see in retrospect that you've always had an aversion, or you've always had trouble with, harvesting, cultivating, whatever, that plant that corresponds to, let's say, your bum Mars, or whatever.
I need to go back and think about the ones that I've killed over the course of the year.
Yeah.
Then tell me, because there's that thing.
Because I find it fascinating. It does appear to be more of an issue with talisman creation, right? Like, you might not be the best person for that Jupiter-Sag talisman, depending on where Jupiter is, right? And I find it fascinating to have, the idea of, you should have, a network of people who know their charts quite competently, who also create talismans, and hope you get a broad enough range. So, because I'm trying to, that would be a sort of fun thing to play with, get people to say, well, I'm good at this and bad at this, and look forward and do it as a group project, because it's more important with talismans, right?
Yeah, well, especially when you're doing, there are a great number of different talismans described in the Picatrix, but sort of baseline is planetary talismans, where it's this is a Saturn thing, right? Or as well as fixed star talismans, this is a Sirius ring. It contains the potency of that star. And so what's interesting is, so people, let's say you've got a really strong Jupiter, not only strong, but you are a child of Jupiter, you run on Jupiter. That's, you're big, you're expansive, you're positive, you try to uplift people, you're pretty sure things are going to work out for you, you're already running on that, and so adding more of that isn't going to feel alien, and it's not going to challenge you. If you're a very Saturnian person, if you rely on your caution and suspicion to make prudent decisions, you're not into optimism because you're actually doing a very high-level form of pessimism, right? Then adding that that bouncy Jupiterian energy is you're going to be one, this is kind of contradicting the way that I make my way through the world, and two, I'm not sure if I like it, and that could be curative, right? That could be something that you place on your person and connect with once a week on Jupiter's day, but it's unlikely to be something that you're just going to run all the time easily. Yeah. And so generally speaking, part of, and everybody that I know who's gotten serious, and by serious I mean obsessive, about making astrological talismans, everybody regards it as an experiment. You can know all the theory, you do your very best job with the election, but then the thing is born, and you're like, okay, what's your name? You know, what's your, I thought you were going to be like this. Let's, excuse me, let's see how we get along. And, you know, with some of, and so there's an irony here, because if you could incorporate that, power into what you're already doing seamlessly, it would be only because you already possess that potency. And so part of the game with talismans like that is you're getting something good that you don't have, right? That's funny because some people are like, oh, I've got Jupiter in Sagittarius. Should I wear a Jupiter in Sagittarius talisman? It's like, well, it's certainly not going to hurt, but like you already are a talisman of that, right? You're already running that. And so
I'd like to ask a quick question here, because we're talking about the construction of talismans, and we bring things into being. Like when you create this talisman, whatever form you choose, you bring it into being. Surely it has a lifespan. When does it run out? At what time does that talisman no longer contain the energy, and does it need to be disposed of thoughtfully, or is there a deconstruction process that one needs to be aware of?
So how long does it live? It lives until it decides it wants you to lose it, until it breaks mysteriously. What's interesting is the point of working with metal and stone is that they're the most enduring materials available to us. If left to their own devices, a stone will outlive you, me, and everybody in this room, or most stones, right? You're going to say something, Gordon?
Well, because it's that question, like the care and feeding of your pet rock, right? Because I don't think. So I had this weird experience. My first trip to, I think it was Florence, and there was an antique market, and I was experimenting with psychometry at the time, and I'm like, I'm going to go through here, and it's an antique market in Florence. I'm going to go through and hold these things, and no talismans, but there were things that had been hidden in attics from the Nazis. There were stuff that should have been buried with a grandmother, like rosaries and this kind of stuff. And that's kind of coming back to, is there a more satisfying way of thinking about the metaphysics of talismans? Because I don't think the sort of run-out battery model is quite Neoplatonic, but we have the opportunity to, this is my thing about animism, right? Like there are certain, if a non-human quote-unquote object has some sort of trajectory or destiny, it is worth considering it a person. And so persons live and die, but they also abandon you and end up in an antique store, antique market in Florence, and so on. And I haven't really had one. I haven't had that many properly made astrological talismans, like maybe 3, and they haven't run out. 2 have been lost.
All right, well, let me just jump in on that. Yeah. So I've made what were called talismans by other methods, and those I definitely felt had a clock or a battery drain on them. There's also, if we look at people like charge crystals and such, those run out. What you're doing, another way to look at what you're doing with the full Picatrixian Astro Talisman thing, is you're rewriting that thing's DNA. And so what I found is that the charge will wane, and if I just leave it alone for a day, it's exactly where it was when it was created, because it has its own idea, and it's tired. If we're talking about it in terms of a being, it just goes to sleep and wakes up refreshed. But the reconfiguration is at a deep enough level that it knows what it wants to be. It's not the battery is just like, I'll hold electricity if that's around, if not, whatever. Right? It doesn't have that intention. And what you were saying, Gordon, about the ones that get lost, everybody I know who's gotten obsessed, serious, done a lot of experiments, they hide. They don't want you to wear them. Some of them, and I remember one of the first things that taught me that was I had a friend/client who was going to propose to a woman he'd been living with for a while, and he's like, I want the perfect marriage talisman, and I want the wedding ring to be the perfect marriage. And we, looked through it's many elections. We found like this perfect Venus in Pisces conjunct Jupiter in Pisces, on the rising, just gorgeous election, right? And so that got made, and that thing was amazing. It was like these beams of like piercing joy just to look at it. And so we gave that to him. We felt like we'd done a really good job. This is going to work awesome. It was like, the talisman for the perfect marriage. And he kept trying to propose with the thing in his pocket, and something would go wrong, and he couldn't do it. Sometimes it was an external thing, couldn't do it. Sometimes it was an internal thing, that's not the right time. And then so 6 months later, he finds out that she'd been cheating on him for like a year and had this whole other side of her life. And so it's very simple, like the talisman of the perfect marriage didn't want that.
Yeah.
Like that would not have been a perfect marriage. There's an incompatibility between the nature of the thing and the nature of the situation.
This is the animism model.
Yeah.
So the animism model for me is generally, I'm sure this is the case with some of you, a lot of spirits tend to delight in reorganizing the physical, for want of a less complicated term, all being in it, in the same way we rather delight in astral travel and entheogenic experiences. So you kind of give this thing you give it a car. It's like, oh my god, I'm on Earth. I'm in a car. This is amazing. So you said to Tony,
a durable body of metal and stone.
You said to Tony in a chat recently, which I quite like, speaking of Tony Mack, I quite like this statement that having a talisman, especially a big talisman, is a kind of initiation. Is it sort of like, I have a space toddler now?
Yeah. And that actually came out of a Saturn project that we did together in 2011. Yeah, it was the end of 2011, back when Saturn was in Libra. And we did these super cool onyx Saturn rings because Saturn was in as good a condition as it was going to be in for 20 or 30 more years. And it was sort of like once we decided that was going to be what we were going to do, the terrain leading up to creating it and following it was deformed and changed. Not deformed in a bad way, but just reshaped by the fact that we were doing that and bringing that into our lives. Like there were internal things, there were also funny external things. Tony couldn't find anybody who would do the pyramid cut on the onyx the way that we decided we wanted, except for an old man. Right? It was only the old man took forever, and we almost didn't get the stone. So it's like, okay, Saturn is delays, and looks like old men, it teaches you patience. And that guy ended up being a benefactor to Tony, like a sort of friendly, helpful old Saturn. This is how you do things the right way. Also, he's a jeweler. People who work with stones are, that's a Saturnian profession. A little Venus there too, but and so in learning to wear that, I became aware of why the position that I have Saturn in is not exalted, right? I had Saturn in Virgo, and I'm really good at building a structure around an obsession, around hyper focusing on something, building a little tunnel, a little writing prison, right? And then just wearing the Saturn and Libra thing around, I was like, oh. In looking at the Libran principle of balance between you for balance to be involved, you have to have at least 2 points, maybe more. And I was like, oh, being responsible is not just doing that one thing super well. It's balancing between all of your obligations. Like you choose some of them, you don't choose some of them. Saturn sees them all. Like that's the art, is balancing between all of your obligations. I was like, I don't do that. I pick one and triple down on it.
That's something that I just wanted to ask about, actually, because we're talking a lot about talismanic magic and astrological magic, and it would be easy to believe that talismanic magic is astrological magic. Is there another type of astrological magic? And you just sort of started speaking about that, this awareness of chart, this awareness of place, this awareness of self. How can that be applied to magic and not necessarily a talisman? How can those skills be funneled in to something else separate to a talisman?
If people actually want to have an experiential feel of it, Caitlin has a planetary magic bar in the room with some stuff from Spear and Sundry. So, and there's some really intense things. That's just a reminder.
Yeah.
For the drinks up there, try them on, you know.
Well, and so one thing, so in terms of planetary magic stuff or astrological magic stuff, there's talismans are sort of at the top of the ziggurat, right?
So if you don't do a talisman, does that make you a bad astrological magician?
Well, if you would
That's
if you would like to refer to yourself as that, you should probably experiment with talismans. But there's plenty of astrological magic you can do. It's not talismans, right? So if talismans are up there because they require the most time, they require the most energy, they're the most expensive, they also
are they the most effective?
Effective relative, we can judge effectiveness relative to what needs to be done.
Will they get the job done then?
Well, right, but it depends which job. Also, talismans are not, or there are some exceptions, but they tend not to be single goal creations. Mm-hmm. They're like, I want to distort my life in this way so that all of these different good, desirable things come in. It's much more of, it's much closer to getting an artificial limb put on, or it's modifying the life structure. It's almost more kingdom magic than it is single shot stuff. Okay. So in addition to talismans, you can also make, we can enchant materia, right? Talismanic materia. In here we have things like oils, incenses, hydrosols, where you're loading that, you're using a similar protocol to what you would do for planetary, for talismanic magic. You're connecting stuff and power, but it's stuff like it's vegetable matter, which will not last forever, or it's an oil, and so that allows you to do single shots of things. You put a little oil on to gain a particular power, or you use that incense to boost another something that might be non-planetary, but is, let's say you use the Venus stuff that was created at maximum Venus conditions in order to further empower your love magic, which might be performed in a manner that is not referencing astrology at all, but the Venus stuff will do that, right? So you can borrow power from that. As far as one-shot operations in astrology or with astrological magic, we're really looking at what get called in the Picatrix petitions, right? Where you're not making a thing, you're not making a permanent or a semi-permanent alteration to your life. What you're doing, or to self, what you're doing instead is you're like, okay, Mars, I hate this fucker. I know you do too. I know you like to burn things. Can you burn him, right? Or like, Jupiter, I know you're in a good condition. I know you're in a good mood. I really need this job, right? And so those are the petitions, as they're generally called, are your practical one-shot things, and they require less in terms of the timing than the full talisman.
I like that, but do you have to anthropomorphize a planet in order to connect with that planet? Gordon?
I don't think you need to go full anthropomorphization to consider personhood. But basically, from a chaos magic perspective, it's performative, and if it works, keep doing it, right? Because how else outside of talismans you use timing is kind of like, for instance, when you guys, your book club is doing chaos protocols, right?
Yes, we are.
Yeah. In the sigil course in the premium membership area, I basically just port the Solomonic timing rules, make sure the moon isn't shit, pick a lunar day, get the planet and the day right for the kind of macro goal you're after. So that's the kind of stuff. There's two things to that, which is, again, it's free, and if it's not emergency magic, like, why wouldn't you just do those 3 or 4 simple steps just to make, like, what if it helps, what if it works, because guess what, it does. That's the other one. And the baseline thing, we've had long discussions about what are the best in terms of planetary prayers, because I've been doing the planetary prayers from the Hygromantia, and so the premium members and so on, and I still, from a life perspective, I feel like they're the best, not for petitions, but like from a just when it's Friday, you do your Venus. When it's Saturday, you do your Saturn. And these are your kind of daily planetary presence. That is a really good baseline thing from which, when it comes to doing non-talismanic astrological magic, you kind of already know the feel of it, and you're sort of reasonably well introduced. And so you can kind of dial up and down the complexity if you can sort of build in baseline planetary observations on a daily basis. That's kind of more the down and dirty Huon stuff, I think.
It's a little hard, though, to ignore that the deity aspect of it when you're talking to planets that have been named after Greco-Roman gods. And so when you speak, if you're influenced by mythology, which, well, I'm 100% influenced by mythology, so then it's hard not to anthropomorphize it. And if you don't anthropomorphize it, if you don't consider it to be either an extension of a person or a deity up in the sky, like how can you connect passionately with it?
Let me jump in. So a couple things. One, I don't think they mind being anthropomorphized. Two, even though the planets are named after Greco-Roman gods or the Roman names, they are, if we look at how the practitioners during that Greco-Roman era were relating to them, they would say, that is the star of Aries. They would say, that's Mars's planet, right? They didn't say that's Mars, right? But you can see that particular divine influence coming through that planet, right? And so the relationship between planet and deity was a little bit more complex. Two, I think that one of there's a school of thought in terms of how to pray or how to evoke a particular divine power, and that is to describe describe a power whose effects you can see but whose source you cannot, by means of verbs, by means of what it does. You who burn things, you who, let me not do Mars, so Jupiter, like, you who raise the spirits of women and men, you who grant success, you who causes the thunder to roll. These are the signs by which I know you. And if you do a thorough version of that, and also they'll do like, you who take 12 years to go around, you whose color looks like that. You describe all of that and all of the effects on Earth. You who, there's this, is it Bruno? Anyway, there's this one text that has like a daily prayer to Jupiter, and it calls upon Jupiter to emit his eagles. Jupiter, emit your eagle. These are your animals, right? You aren't an eagle, but we know you through the actions and the qualities of the eagle. The eagle is your child, right? And so it's sort of the invisible parent, but we can know them by, it's the invisible giant. We can point to their giant footprints. We can point to, we know their children, we are their children. And so that's extended a little bit further in the Picatrix calls, where they, because the Picatrix is, it's not a single lockbox tradition where this is the god of this planet and this is its name. It's like there are usually 5 or 6 different god names. Oh yeah, they're like, the Greeks call you this, the Persians call you this, the Indians call you this, right? And so we're in a sense, we're specifying a very particular power by circumambulating it, by drawing a circle around and be like, inside this circle, that's where you are, because I know all the shit about you.
There's actually been a couple of times in the history of astrology where they've had to distance themselves from the implied polytheism. In Alexandria, there was the first attempt to science it up, right? Like, well, maybe it's some sort of energies or what have you. And obviously, in Arabic Muslim magic, there does need to be a bit of a what are you kind of thing. And then we hit the 20th century with its ridiculous materialism and psychology, where it's like, oh, well, maybe it's just a wishy-washy method of archetypal psychology. So it's happened a couple of times. The relationship, because it is so long-lived, means that you don't have to think of it as Zeus. You don't have to think of it as that kind of stuff, because we've been doing this for a long time, and we've actually been attempting with varying degrees of success and satisfaction in navigating that. And one of the ones maybe you'll like, which I kind of comes back to the Soviet large-scale data experiments, where certain things would correlate to particular configurations, which was presumably used in operational planning, right? Basically, the Soviets did at least a small amount of astrological timing magic because it's baked into the universe. So if you're talking about the prayer, say it because it kind of brings you into alignment with that sort of waveform, rather than going, well, how does this work? Do I have to think that God lives in a planet? Do I have, does that God rule the planet? Just generally said, and I can kind of port a spirit experience that's kind of useful, going back to what you were saying. The Greeks call you this, the Persians call you this. There are, whatever it is, they like being told the things they're good at. They also like it appears, at least they have one experience with a grimoire spirit that is like this. Two, actually. But they also like it when you kind of solve that game. Because you said, well, the Romans called it Jupiter, right? So you got Jupiter, you got Zeus, then you have all the sky gods that are the sort of the things that fed into Jupiter and Zeus in Europe. Venus is the best example because you have Ishtar the whole way back in Sumer. So they love it when you actually know as much of the lineage as you know, and you'll find it kind of crackle in a different way. So that, for me, has been performatively the experience. Say the things that they're rad at, and then also let them know that you actually know that you've been rad for a long time, and you've been calling it this and this and this, and there's a crackle of recognition.
And so, just to jump in on that, and to differentiate astrological magic with the planetary spirits, intelligences, from say a more summoning style, like a grimoire style, where you're dealing with angels and such. There is an intimate familiarity between the intelligences and powers of the planets and stars and the Earth and the humans that are there that is long running. Like this, this comes back to the way that our conversation began. We've been doing a dialogue with the celestial the entire time. And so it's not, I don't know, some people may have had the experience of some spirits don't seem to intersect very well with the human wavelength, either because they don't like it, they're uninterested, or nobody's said their name in 3,000 years. Not the case at all. The planetary, that potency that we're trying to tap actively in planetary magic, and that we are seeing the results of passively in astrological divination, they're already here. They already know your name, and so there's just a difference in quality from a grimoire spirit.
So it's more just about getting their attention. They're already here. You do the right things. You say the right things. In alignment.
This is what I find particularly delightful. A decade ago, once I worked out I couldn't fall on the lazy chaos magic position and this is all garbage. What I like about astrological magic, or even just thinking with astrology in a magical context, is probably a better way of saying that, is it's going to happen anyway. Venus gonna Venus, Jupiter gonna Jupiter, and you can get on board the J train if that's something you're after, or it's just going to go past anyway. So there's a really kind of delightful flow model in it, which is, you have a Saturday, then you have a Sunday, then you have a Monday. You can get on board these things because it doesn't really matter. They don't matter to you in a benign way. They're functions of the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And you can kind of glide with them when you need to or not. And I find that really elegant. I think that's a fun thing to sort of base around, and then you get to do the tactical stuff like the sigil magic and the spirit summoning and so on. It's just a really, it's a really pleasing way to live in a magical universe, I think.
So how important is it to know your own chart in astrological timing and astrological magic? Is that the first step, or do you come at it from a different direction?
There are a lot of these tools like planetary days of the moon, which are just the phases of the moon. You can use those effectively without ever having looked at your your chart.
Okay.
There's a lot of like, so you know, part of what I think Gordon and I were hoping to communicate effectively was there's so much there, but you can use one little piece of it and it'll work fine. Just use don't try to do full planet, don't try to do the full astrological talisman. Don't do the Mars talisman just because it's Tuesday, but you can do your Mars, whatever in your life fits in the Mars category on Tuesday or in the day of Mars, and just get that wind at your back.
Yeah.
Be like, oh, what is the one day I'm absolutely not going to not go to the gym, right?
Yeah,
what's my one day that I have to, actually try hard at stuff.
And
right?
when you start to do that, and I love this is the delightful part, when you start to do that, so you do try to, that combination, it depends on the operation, right? Like, it's quite clear, it's not anywhere in the grimoires where you need to have any kind of, like, this is your specific, like, you need these landing coordinates to do this operation, because they've jailbroken it for you. Spirits are sublunar, so just make sure the moon is right and get the hours right. So for that, you don't need it. It depends where you are, but like the thing I love about just trying to organize, if possible, the things in your life to that planetary day dim awareness of what the planets are actually doing. You start to lean into it before you realize it, and you end up in some sort of down market Marsilio Ficino situation where you just get a bit more Mars on Tuesday. Like, Mars kind of likes these things, and if that's something you need to go, well, it's that really, and I love this because this is an implied return to that technical Hermetica metaphysics. So if you put some Venus things on Friday because you need some Venus things to go well, just Venus up your day a little bit as well. Just kind of have Venusian things as well as the day and the hour, and watch what happens. And I love that language.
Mm-hmm.
It's lovely, actually, because that was my 20s on Friday with Venus. And if you're single and looking to pick up, just tuck that one in your back pocket.
There you go.
Just
There's actually some pretty sweet Venus stuff on the planetary bar if you are single. Or not. Live your best life.
Yeah. Right. Well, and so I really like the way that you're talking about that, and that intersects with some traditional practices, and also another side of it. We've been talking about what can I get? How do I get a thing? How do I make my things work? Right. But there's also honoring. There's the giving the sky devils their due, like giving, just a little respect to Venus on Venus's day, a little respect to Mars on Mars's day, and that has, that's like that little bit of like 5% life improvement on every, each of,
up.
yeah, and it adds up, and then, by just acknowledging, right?
Okay, so that's what you mean by respect. Just so we can be clear about here, give some respect. So how would you show, typically, easily, in the day, show some respect?
So, I'm a huge fan of daily practice. Not like I'm a fan of daily practices in general, but as far as getting a taste of astrological magic and timing, beginning to do like just cut 5 minutes out of your day to honor that particular planet's influence. And so how do you do that? It's how you how you would honor any being, right? Here's some things that you like. I'm going to say some nice stuff about you, right? You're really good at that. Words, sounds, colors. Some people do. I like doing offerings. Here's some of the booze you like. I make like kind of I like to make like kind of a fancy lady drink for Venus.
Oh.
I'll go pick a flower in the yard and say a little cutting prayer, on this day, the day and hour of Venus, blah, blah, and put that on the Venus altar, which can be formal or it can just be a little corner, of your office or room.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, whatever words, I've used lots of different prepackaged things like the Orphic hymns and the planetary conjurations from the Picatrix and various mantras, and then I end up kind of writing a lot of my own work because it's nice if someone reads you a beautiful poem that they got from a book. It's even better if they write you a beautiful poem for you. And so that's not something you have to do. It just emerges out of the practice.
you can almost, like, it emerges, you can almost do it non-verbally. Like, when I go into the spirit room to do the daily planetary prayer, mine's still the hygromantia, but you feel it coming up before you start saying the words anyway. With enough practice, you know exactly what it's like with different spirits. So I think that is, your life will change dramatically if you just, and it comes back to the ancestors thing. When you're talking about paying respect, right? Bear in mind, as far back as I can see, in terms of earliest continually practicing cultures, we have cultures who consider the stars our ancestors. We come from them. That's what they're saying. And our 35,000 years later, how that is expressed in our cultures, this far down the timeline, is things like planetary prayers. But you can pull that thread. They are our ancestors. Like that respect thing. You can consider planetary prayers an ancestral practice because, again, all life came from space.
And as is commonly said, we're all star stuff.
Yeah. So that's it's endlessly enriching to think about in that direction.
Okay, this time the battery actually has run out on that.
Brian, you got the 2 spare batteries?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Just keep recording on this one. Or?
If she's still going, yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Well, and so another piece that hooks. Right?
Going, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So another piece that hooks into that. So we have the should we say the relatively, I was going to say neutral, but we have the practice of observance, right? And then on the big days when you're basically doing a big ask, you want a favor, or you're making the thing, or you're enchanting the materia. In a sense, what you're doing is you're just ratcheting up on top of the platform of your daily practice, right? The base doesn't change, you just add stuff to it, right?
Yeah.
And then, again, we've been talking a lot about about how can I do a thing so that it works and I get the thing. There's also, how do I make a bad thing go away? How do I remove this particular feature of my life, or at least tone down what I've realized is a strong pattern in my life, either one that I embody or one that just keeps happening, a pattern with other people, a pattern of luck with business or whatever. And so that's where we get into remediation, right? Where we're maybe sanding down some of the rougher edges of the chart, or we're moistening a particularly dry place.
Is this like astrological road opening?
I think the hygromantia prayers are universal lubricant. So, third dick joke of the stage. But, so remediation, the removal of friction, yes, you might have some fairly poor aspects for something that's quite important. And there are opportunities in weekly / daily practice, like every day, to lubricate.
Yeah, well, and also to change over time. There's absolutely, I would say most human growth and learning can be conceptualized within an alchemical framework pretty effectively. It's still the same matter, but you've changed it through heating over time, through heating, all of the different heating, cooling, et cetera, taking it apart, putting it back together. And that's something that we do anyway as we live and learn. Like, oh yeah, I used to have this issue, with authority figures, and I can see, we look, we'll look at that, and it's very common, especially in the more psychologically focused schools of astrology, be like, oh yeah, well that's your Saturn, that's your daddy issues, right? And we can work on that in a psychological way, like a therapy way. But we can also, if we look historically, there are a lot of, if we see that the daddy issue stuff is coming from the Saturnian position, we can work on the Saturnian position more directly, right? And so that's where you get practices like planetary donation or charity, where what you're doing is like, so for example with Saturn, is you literally give your time, money, energy to the children of Saturn. That might be on every Saturday, you make it a habit to feed the crows on your property. It might be that you make a little vow that you will always give money whenever a homeless person asks. It might be that you donate to a miners' charity, people who labor within the earth and who get blackballed, right? You donate to that to make their lives better. And the idea, the idea behind planetary charity or donation is improving your relationship not just with Dad, right, who maybe was a minor, but with that whole sphere of your life. Like you're kind of improving your relationship to the source of several different event types, which you notice keep happening. And then there are various, especially in Vedic astrology, there's some really good methods for figuring out exactly what God form or exactly what sub God would fix your issue with Saturn most effectively, and then setting up a prayer or mantra practice to that specific wavelength of the divine that's going to be the medicine. And so that actually goes back to what you were saying earlier with like, well, so is Jupiter like a philanderer with lightning bolts, right?
Is he?
Sometimes.
Oh.
That can come through, but, and again, you see this especially in the Vedic material, they're like, oh, well, if Jupiter is in this, and this position, you get Indra, who is a philanderer with lightning bolts. If it's in this position, it's going to look like Brihaspati, who is the divine guru, who is the teacher of all of the teachers, who is the priest to the gods themselves. For example, with Saturn, yeah, sometimes Saturn looks like a crusty old man. Sometimes it looks like the devil. And that, you know, your Saturn remediation might actually be getting right with the devil. If it's in a water sign in this particular position, it might be that you need to work with Saturn through Kali, right? Or it might be that you need to work with Saturn through the figure of the divine architect, right? And so there's a little bit of science there, where it's not just like boom planet, boom boom God, but each one opens up a range, and that one in that range, those figures have different impacts on a person, and figuring out who to connect to and who has your medicine is part of that. Makes sense.
Interesting. So there's a lot of deity there.
This would actually, like, this is an example of practice that definitely requires a chart, as opposed to...
Oh yeah, but you can have somebody look at it and give you the practice.
No, exactly.
And then your job is just to do it.
So in terms of what have we got? We've got some sort of daily practice that you can kind of scale up and down depending on things you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Again, from the sigil perspective, moon, lunar days, planetary days and hours makes it work night and day different, which is fascinating because it is more or less the same protocols of spirit evocation. I don't know what sigils are, I don't know what spirits are, but there is a kind of baseline is that planetary awareness and daily propitiation, and then there's the kind of tactical stuff you can do that doesn't require a chart, and then when you want to get like full astro wizard, get your chart, go and find someone who can give you a precision mantra for the, for the things that maybe need lubrication. And this is a really great discussion for me as far as I'm concerned, because it's exactly the blending that I want to see. I want to see, like, look, everyone, it's seriously not that difficult. You can do a daily planetary prayer. The others, look, locating the mantra is difficult, don't get me wrong, but the daily planetary prayer and the rest of it is where I think both sides in this semi-artificial divide between astrology and magic need to get a little bit over themselves and meet in the middle, because structurally and far enough back in the timeline, it's literally the same thing, like literally the same thing.
I like that. I like that you mentioned sigil magic then, because remember how we were having that conversation like a few weeks ago, and I said to you, I've got sigil envy.
Oh yeah.
How can I use my, like, I would like to know if I can pretty those sigils up if I work a little more with, say, Venus. Like, can you use it in a magical aesthetic perspective? Can you use it to present yourself? Can you use it to decorate your home kind of business?
This is the Massilia Ficino stuff I mentioned earlier. For you, I would, like, you just get better at sigils with practice. There's no like astro trick to that. But I think what you're talking about there, you have the sort of beginning of sort of, in the Renaissance, Massilia Ficino he essentially invented therapy. And he did it by using planets. So for people who needed more Venus, they'd be in, you know, a sort of pink room, and there'd be Venusian music playing, and the smell would be quite feminine and Venusian. And like, so he'd do a less or lower resolution version of what Austin was talking about with a Vedic system. But that's exactly how you're supposed to do this performative astrological magic. You have feasts for Jupiter. You do all these kind of things, and you learn that like you can get. An Agrippa is fine. Like literally any kind of list of like, well, these things fall into these categories, is a great place to start. But then you kind of got to find the feel of it, which comes with the daily practice.
Well, you'll
Yes.
it's sort of like the lists are in a sense like a string of stones, but you can't see the string. But once you play with that, you're like, okay, Jupiter is eagles, and it's this kind of blue, and it's thunder. And then when you start working with that, you'll be like, oh, you'll be able to feel the string. And so you'll be able, and once you can feel the string, then you know what other things go on there that aren't on like your big book list.
Because we sort of dreading this, but not really. Austin and I were kind of divvying up topic areas when it came to like, well, who's going to talk about what at this event? Obviously, I chose astrology, clearly, and I'm like, who wants to deal with music? Because this is actually a music venue, obviously. And I said, how are we going to deal with that? Because there's some fascinating stuff to do with, say, Baroque music. This is Dr. Farrell's latest book, right? Baroque music was designed on the idea that there are meanings embedded in the universe rather than like someone internally delivering their creation to you. And there are tantalizing data that is true, which is your memory recall improved if you play Baroque music while you're trying to study and so on. So, but what it has is basically every planet, right? Baroque music is designed to be coherent. And so when it comes to, I asked Austin, like, well, are people going to ask, like, what note is Venus? And so what is, like, Saturnine music? What is the sound of Saturn? Just picking up on what we just said about how you find that thread. What is Saturnine music? Like, is it a note? Or is it...
Well, so funereal music, doom metal, slow, heavy, melancholy.
And this is the language, or feel of it. Like martial music, Mars, obviously, but it's finding that, coming back to that technical Hermetica language that I think you layer on top of that daily, like, planetary prayer practice, just so you kind of get the feel of it, and all of a sudden you're doing this non-verbal technical Hermetica.
That's good. That's exactly right, because we all have our strengths and our weaknesses. We're all attracted to different, pathways to the divine, we'll call it. We're all attracted to different things, and so for some it's art, for others it's music, which is, yes, an extension of art. But what about mathematics? And like, there has to be an approach for everybody, doesn't there?
Well, and there is.
Doesn't there?
Right, there's, even in the most basic tables of correspondences for planets, you have a color, you have types of noise, you have types of animals, like you have plants, and so it's like you may grasp that invisible thread that connects all the things in the string because you know plants, and you're like, oh, those 4 plants are all solar. Well, I get what all of those are pointing to, and I wanted to add as well, because this sort of came up earlier. In the Picatrix, the asking for a big favor operations, you were supposed to dress as a child of that planet. There's literally a dress-up component, right? So with Mars, it's dress up as a soldier. Whatever weapons you have, strap them to your belt. If what?
This is so fun.
Yeah,
you could dress up and her eyes go bing.
Right, for Saturn, be a goth, right? For Venus, I don't know, look nice, maybe use soap before you you do the thing. Not so much for Saturn, but anyway, so that's baked in there.
And
Actually, one thing with Mercury, you're actually supposed to bring a notebook and pretend to be writing in it like a scribe while you're doing the operation.
So you're fake journaling.
Yeah, you're just like, check me out. I'm totally,
I'm into this. This is me. I'm here committed.
I'm taking really precise notes.
Does it matter what paper and pen in that context? Does it have to be the best of everything, and you have to be believable?
No,
are you playing a part?
I think it certainly, the text certainly suggests that's basically a prop. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But and what's interesting is if you think about that in a less theatrical way. Like it makes you think, well, what things do I have in my life that are already mercurial? Like, oh, I've always got 3 notebooks with me that I'm writing, so I'll bring that.
That's exactly it. That's a technical Hermetica thing, right? So if it works, and it does, so you will bring a certain collection of herbs and stones together for a particular planet. The fact that that works means that every rose everywhere is governed by this thing. So that's the kind of horizontal interior language I want to get to. You should certainly use kind of like nicer things just because it feels like it will be thicker in a hyper thick sense. But honestly, roses in the wild are governed by the same configuration as roses in a garden, or the whole thing doesn't work. And so that's the kind of coming back to the language, that sort of horizontal language piece that is so important. And if you just really stop and think about that and go, well, I'm going to use this as my metaphysics, then it brings it into alignment with the rest of the world. Like it literally brings it into alignment that you have, in the same way, every Tuesday is in some sense the same Tuesday. Every wallaby is governed by the same, God only knows what. But it's like, that's what you were saying when you find 4 solar plants and you feel what it is, how they're solar. That's there in the back of the Kirinides with its weird animal governances as well. And that's the bit that I find really fascinating, is that we used to have a more coherent language for how all solar things in the world were solar and all Jupiterian things in the world were Jupiterian. And we only have pieces of it now, and frankly the only way back to fluency is that kind of experimentation.
That's exactly right.
Just don't call it talismanic magic.
So we have reached that portion of the evening where you can ask yourselves those very important questions that I asked you to think up. And so raise your hand if you have one, or maybe stand up.
Ryan, were we organised enough to get like a mic for the audience? Is he even back there? How's that sound, guys?
Ryan, are you there, Ryan?
Oh, right, okay, fair enough. Okay, if people want to ask questions, I would totally take this one out there, but we're wired.
I have a question. Should I come up?
Yep.
You know how you're talking about like making talismans and music scales and things like that? I was wondering, how does the law of vibration, within music, as in opera can resonate at a very high vibration, whereas other music may resonate at a lower vibration. Like, how does that become influenced by the planets and their alignment within the human being and what they're creating? Because that's what I wondered, is how does the vibrational scale shift from painting, like as in colour, to sound vibration, to the planetary alignments and what they represent?
See, fantastic question, thank you very much, which is also in a way one I was terrified of getting, which is why I in fact did prepare an answer for it. The short answer is they do. Like, that's whatever this actual science of this is, rather than gay science, astrology, we all know. Yeah. They clearly do. With a wave model or a cycle model, you are dealing literally with waveforms. So there has to be a match. However, if you try to, this is a good example of if you try to find which particular notes or vibrations match which particular planet, it gets a bit messy. So it does. I don't think it's as good as, like, if you settle on, F is Mercury, right? I don't think that's as effective in influencing your kind of like self or energy as playing mercurial music is. And I think, and I landed on that based on Dr. Farrell's somewhat patchy book about the fact that the Baroque thing seems to work because it is the full waveform. Like, it is just coherence. It is a coherent, happily operating universe, and you resonate with that rather than using a particular tone or note to remediate something, and that's where I kind of landed on the music thing, because you're right, it has to be aligned. I just can't find a coherent mapping of like music to the planets, and two, whether that is as good as using Saturnine music or Mercurial music.
So I want to jump in. I think that's a really good point. So for one thing, one note being played is not music, unless we're very modern art in our conception of music. And for me, I'm more visual, and so I've spent a lot of time looking at different colors associated with planets. And what I find the most evocative are color schemes. So, for example, Saturn is often associated with indigo, like the deep blue, almost black of the night sky. But then in other systems, you see associated with a sandy yellow, sort of a dull brown sandy yellow, like the visible light of the star or the planet. And so, for me, I was like, oh, it's the desert at night. It's the brown soil with the darkness above. And, the desert at night, if you place yourself there, if you journey there, if you imagine yourself there, you instantly get a Saturn feel that you don't get from just indigo. Or, with Venus, like pastel tones, sea colors, like green, yes, but like a green that places you in a garden where there's brightly colored fruit, right? The green patina on corroding copper. Right, that like gentle, beautiful decay, just like like a flower does. It's your entry point in, and like one color, just like one note, may be necessary to compose something which, for lack of a better term, vibrates at that level, but it's an entry point.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
Performatively or in ceremony, you've got to get the thing that will make you feel Venusian or Mercurial or whatever, and then at some stage in that process it will kind of lift off, and you'll get those sort of desert at night sensations, and I've hit it. So my particular combination of color and scent, and this choice of music kind of gets the flying saucer faster and faster, and it's done, right? I didn't know what else I was doing with this. Am I stirring a pot? Now I'm going to go back to flying saucer.
It's interesting. I'm just curious because if you've spent any time exploring the ASMR community on YouTube, you'll find that there are these binaural beats that will bring you wealth, and this binaural beat that's going to just fix your love life and all of this sort of business. And it's like this pulsing thing that you're supposed to listen to on a religious basis. And I was rather curious about that.
Well, those things definitely have an effect, and they've been used for development of astral travel skills and training of remote viewers in the CIA. They use binaural beats and all that kind of stuff. So it clearly has an effect, but I don't think it's like astrological magic. There are a few times in history, and Marsilio Ficino is an example, where we kind of know the general process about how this works, and it is to get the sense and the colors and the sound and the timing right, and something happens when you do that. So that's the kind of my kind of aversion to like a tonal response, like what's the mercurial tone, is like it might do something, I don't know, because clearly there is a tone associated with Mercury in the universe, but we know that these configuring this stuff will get you the results.
Yeah, well, and also you have to subject something to that tone to Mercury. And so one of the things that makes me think about is in the Vedic mantra system, as it connects to the planets, each planet has a seed syllable that it connects with, and so but you don't just do the seed syllable. That many of the mantras that are connected to deities that are connected to that planet will contain that seed syllable, so you make sure to hit F, or you make sure to include green, but you just make sure the green is there with the rest of it, right? And so you have that anchoring to the single association, but in the midst of something more complex and suited to the nature of your operation and intention.
Interesting. Does anyone else have a question? Yes.
When it comes to doing this from Northwest and chart and past will has a lot to do with it, or how do you kind of help them with how do you bring them into their remediation as well as you actually really creating Avalon for them?
Well, so
Goes around that.
yeah, that's a big question. I'm going to answer a little bit now, and then once drinks are served, come ask me again. We'll talk more about that. But generally speaking, I look for the problem in the chart. I look for what looks like it's going to be a problem, and I listen to the problems that a person has, and those, if you're doing your job or if your astrology is on, then those should match perfectly. Once you get those lenses to align, you understand where in the language of astrology and in the geography of chart where the issue is coming from. Then you're like, okay, so it is the knee that hurts, right? And then there are a variety of approaches to how do we work with that. And some problems, some issues are much, just like with the body, are much easier and much less risky to poke and prod. Whereas there are some chart configurations, some life issues, which are very sensitive, and you can't just how should we say, you can't just pop the blister, right? You've got to be very tender. And so there are different approaches that are differing levels of intensity, right? And what I would also say is that the person who is wanting to remediate this part of their life has to be on board, and they have to be part of the program. And I usually end up taking a traditional thing like, okay, well, there's fasting on the day of that planet every week as a way of working on some of that planet's issues, right? So if we're working on Mars, fasting every Tuesday from sunup to sundown, right? And then there's planetary charity, but then it's like, okay, in the same, like, where is Mars already in your life? Well, what charity, what Mars is already there? Like, if you've got let's say a person has a really difficult Mars position, and their mom's side of the family was actually military, then like suddenly you've got a very specific angle on Mars and their relationship to Mars. Or their grandpa was a fireman, and so is great grandpa, and you've got, like, as you explore the web of the life, you'll find the stuff that's already there, and you can figure out a way to fit practices into what they're already doing, into the web of relationships that they already have. Same thing with
that's it. There's a natural complexity to that entire question. So,
but that's also, like, I love that as well. That the problems in the chart are emerging in their life anyway, so remediate it in their life. Like,
right.
You will find it's all well and good, as you say, to go, okay, well, so a veterans charity, give money to a veterans charity for Mars, right? But they actually look at their life and go, what if are they estranged from the military side of their family? I'm like, okay, so here's how you remediate. You work on that, but that's how you can kind of performatively bring in whatever it is, and it's impacting you in your life. That's how it works. So impact back, and this is that delightful. I love it. I love that stuff.
All right. So let's move on to another question. I do recall a lady to the front here.
Oh yeah. You mentioned hygromantia prayers, and I haven't heard. I just wondered what that was.
So in the earliest version of the grimoire called the Key of Solomon, the earliest version of it is published by Stephen Skinner under hygromantia. We don't actually know what it was called. It could have. There are other guesses of Apollo Talismatica, but it's a proto version of the Key of Solomon, and it's got a collection of things that all grimoires do. Like, here's how you make your tools. Here's some spirits. There's some random things about a woman in the mountains, but it's got like the timing and planetary prayers. And the ones in that I found the most. We were talking about there's a difference between heating and cooling, or lubricating or not. They're just a really nice, mellow way of just getting right with the planets, rather than if you want Mars or Venus's attention, like hit the Orphic hymns and so on. But that's what it's called, the hygromantia. Any kind of if you Google, I'm sure it'll show up something like Key of Solomon or Solomonic planetary prayers. You get the Agrippa ones and so on. Like the Hygromantia is a great and fascinating book. I think it's my favorite Stephen Skinner book. But yeah, you'll find that stuff online.
Well, and just one thing about the structure of the Hygromantia planetary prayers, as distinguished from what we were talking about, which are largely hymns and exhortations. They're full of praise and they're very excitatory. When you do them, like, all that starts building, which for operations where you're trying to bring as much of that power up, that's what you want to do. But the structure of the Hygromantia prayers is basically like, oh, Jupiter, you were put in place by God and under this angel and under this other angel to do this specific job. Please do that job in ways that are nice to me.
Yeah.
Like, don't get crazy with it. So it's the difference between calling someone into your office and just pumping them up, like you are so awesome, versus calling them in with their boss to talk to them about. You get like a moderated, pacified version of that planet.
They are structurally exquisite.
Yes.
Because as you say, you're not kind of dialing it up. You are acknowledging where it is in the structure of the universe, and that's why they're the best. Because it's always some of them's crazy. Like some of the stuff about God at the bottom of a few of them are quite like, some insane things said there. But it doesn't matter as much as the fact that you get the daily planet where it is supposed to be in the structure of the universe. Our suspicion is that's why they're good at just moderating particularly the downs, but just moderating that contact with the planetary forces, because you're not unbalancing.
Right. You're not. And excessive excitation has a rebound on the other side. If your days start drifting apart, if you're having steroid Tuesdays and hyper-intellectual Wednesdays and like Jovian feast days every Thursday, like, the Hygromantia, you're looking for that moderate expression of the planet in the context of the other planets and of, he who set all the planets in the sky. And that actually has sort of a parallel in the Vedic system, where there are a series of Vishnu mantras for each of the planets, and these are basically Vishnu is considered to have incarnated as all the planets in order to preserve and sustain the world. And so there are these heroic sustainer versions of the planets, where it's like, which all reference the fact that the planets are less than Vishnu in a sense, because Vishnu is all of them, they are not. Yeah, anyway. But it's a different way of looking at calling the boss and the employee in. Be like, I speak to the boss within the employee. I see the boss I see that much more moderate force that created this force which can go to extremes. Anyway, there's a parallel. I feel like I kind of butchered that, but
that's fine. That was complex. Now I'm very confused. Who's got the next question? There was a gentleman to the down. That you.
Me.
I'm looking at you.
Do you feel there are? You guys have studied different types of astrology. Do you feel there are any competing currents within this that are? People have often said, we look at the stuff. There's the stuff which are on the same page, and then there's stuff which don't jive. Do you feel that maybe there have been different currents that are competing, different forms, different ideas, and we're looking at it now as one thing, but it wasn't one thing, or maybe it was one thing, maybe not broken apart. So it's just a broad question. I was wondering if you view it that there were different things going on in it, and now we just have all these parts, and we're trying to basically assemble a whole out of it.
Well, so, if you go to an astrology conference, you'll find that contemporary astrologers are pretty sure that it's 18 different things, and most of those don't agree. Astrologers, are notorious quibblers about method. Nobody's doing it right according to except me and a couple people. That's like every astrologer I've ever met. There are some technical debates, but they're debates, and they're just, I would say, a preference for different wheels, right? Like there's the tropical zodiac, which is a product of the Sun-Earth relationship, and that does certain things. And then there's a sidereal zodiac, which is an idealized sort of half geometry, half exactly where the stars are wheel, and that does certain things. And then there's sort of the stars along the ecliptic without any math thrown at them, and that does other things. And what you find is the most sophisticated methods from different points in time and place are looking at several of those things in relationship to each other. It's often, when it's simplified down, where you have to choose. There are not as many ways to divide the sky as it might seem, especially from the outside. It looks like there's all this stuff, but like astrology is always starting from the actual structure of the sky relative to the Earth. And so there are some, do we do houses this way? Do we do houses that way? But there's less than you might think. And so some of these are a product, some of the differences are a product of the structure of the physical universe. Like you'll find lunar mansion systems that are 27 systems and 28. And that's because the moon takes 27 and change days to do one lap through our sky. And so it's literally a round up or a round down situation, right? And so there aren't an infinite number of possibilities and arguments. And what you see is, or at least in some systems, we use 27 for this, and then we use 28 for this. Because when you do 28, it's better at this. When you do 27, it's better at this.
Interesting. Yeah. Gordon, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I guess, but it comes back to where we started the conversation, which is astrology probably is one thing, which is our relationship on world, off world. So that's probably the only safe thing you can say. It is the one thing. Otherwise, it gets into different pieces. But that's what it is. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's space magic.
Space magic.
I like to tell you.
It's aliens. All right. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So earlier on in the conversation, there was a bit of discussion about the idea of observing what's going on and then interacting. A little bit of conversation just after that about remediation, and I was wondering, probably more directed at Gordon, have you had any emergent ideas that have formed about the relationship between the celestial bodies or astrology and permaculture? Because that seems like an interesting place, and I'd like to please get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, if you listen to, I don't know if you listen to Making Permaculture Stronger, but the host, Dan, he lives up in Castlemaine, and I was up seeing him earlier this week to talk about exactly that, because it's not just, it's an artificial distinction, but I'm going to use it for the sake of answer. It's not just within astrology. My more urgent concern or interest is the fact that we have open and shut data that intentionality improves the nutrition of food that's grown, it improves the health of plants that are grown, it improves the entire system. Now, from a permaculture perspective, the role of the human in a system means, well, that's fundamentally changed, because your responsibility or interaction within your system now includes psi. Now, psi and astrology go well together. They are different descriptions of the fact that the universe is essentially magical, right? And that it provides different approaches to it. As for particular, plantings and permaculture, yes, absolutely. The thing that I've been playing with and trying to reverse isn't working that well. Is moon planting is already very popular, one in permaculture and two in Tasmania. But if any of you have read Jose Leitau's book, the Biblioteca Valenciana, that's how you build a Spanish imperial outpost with just one book in the New World, because you can calculate Easter and all the other holy days and all this crazy stuff. And a lot of it is around particular planting and harvesting and what to do in each month, and beginning with You do a calculation at the beginning of the year as to what kind of year that's going to be from a planting perspective. So I've been playing with that. It's a bit challenging because, of course, I have to reverse the hemispheres. But my macro goal, absolutely, and I'm talking to people about it, is how we systematize intentionality and basically rewild and rethink permaculture, because these things, it needs haunting, just like everything else does, put it that way. And in fact, Dr. Jack Hunter, who's been on the show, will have a book out early next year, which I'm contributing to, called Greening the Paranormal. And it's in fact that, it's that blend. It's that blend of where psi research and parapsychology and eco-thinking and permaculture and whatever match, because the implications of this, the implications of a magical universe, we have to stop thinking with these materialist terms when it comes to food and living systems. Great question, thank you.
Beautiful. Does anybody else have? Yes? Yep.
So, just picking up on the title of the course, no good jokes. But so, as above, so below, I'm assuming we can also flip that around and say, as below, so above. And that as humans, we sort of live in this kind of nexus point between the celestial and the cosmic. So what I'm really curious about is because, so I'm assuming they were all on board that astrology is not causative, so it's more about studying clocks and understanding the impacts in our lives. So could we as much look at things like the plants that brighten up, the solar plants that brighten up in the day of the sun, and the metals, that silver that shines when it's the day of the moon, that sort of thing, and pretty much ditch the stars and just take the timing and the stimulus from things around us on the earth. And I know, that applies in sort of, totem animal kind of senses, but within the Western tradition, I'm curious about what, other than geomancy, what you might have seen, or what thoughts you might have about how we can actually use the living world around us as much of a astrological or genetic clock as we use astrology.
Well, first, I'm not willing to say that everything that we're looking at with astrology is non-causative. Astrology is a mind-rending blend of causal and acausal factors. For example, the sun makes it warm here, right? And the the quote-unquote symbolism or the archetypal power, the divine power of the sun cannot be separated from the physical qualities of the sun. Like the moon has the sun and moon are, the brightest of the celestial bodies, and they have, you have to be stupid not to see it, causal effects. And so the fact that, for example, with Mars isn't close enough to exert enough gravity to move stuff around physically, and then saying, well, there can't be anything causative or remotely resembling the causative if it isn't a gross force, right? I think that's an error in thinking. There is a level of astrology that is 100% acausal divination, that works on the same level of tarot, but there's also this causative clockwork, the obvious causative stuff, and then there's what we don't have good language for in between. You talking about psi, Gordon, made me think of an argument I had with a friend in college when I was 18, because I thought astrology was stupid. And he's like, what about the Gaia hypothesis? Do you think in some meaningful sense the Earth is alive or aware or has intention? And I was like, yeah. I was like, that's pretty reasonable. And he's like, and so none of the other planets have that? And I was like, and I wrote it off at the time, and 10 years later I was like, that motherfucker. And that brings us to the whole gigantic, the whole problem, because we don't have the language or the way of thinking of it, of in what way is psi causative? It's not causative like that, right? But just like meat on stone is not the only cause in the universe. And so we have a little bit of like literally nuclear furnace hitting us with rays, moon distorting the oceans, and then we do have the entirely divinatory level, but then we've got something like psi in between, and that's the implication of planetary magic working at all. And it works more than just at all, is you're connecting to the psi level of the planets, which, you know, don't mind being anthropomorphized.
I think you won't find. I get what you actually do get what you're saying, but there are sort of two things that I would table for consideration. And the first one is I can't think of too many cultures that actually treat the universe as alive that don't in some way incorporate the stars, just if they're ancestors like they are for Buran people or whatever. But the second is you won't, like Liber Hermetis, you won't find a categorization system of the living world that isn't stars. Like you could get decans, you can get planets, whatever. But that is that as above, so below, as above. It's where we keep our stories, potentially where we came from. It's all these marvelous things. So I get what you mean, but you can kind of use like a decanal language as a beginning technical Hermetica and say, right, so I'm going to map horizontally just to living systems and categorize that way, but like you're still in a decanal system, right? Good question though, I like that.
Nice work. Right, does anybody else have a question? Yes, would you like to stand up, please?
So you all practice magic, and you can answer this if you want or not. What was the moment or a moment when you were like, oh shit, this stuff really works?
When you see someone get possessed by a spirit, that's pretty real.
Yeah. I had my first, and it was literally a Scott Cunningham book, but I was 14, and I had a physical manifestation when I built in my parents' yard a circle of stones to do my first ever magic thing. I had a physical manifestation of an entity about that high running through the grass around the circle, plain as you are, and I was 14, and I went, this is a really good book. Turns out it isn't.
I'm not sure. I had like a cascade of little and big, and there's not one that sticks out for me, because by the time I kind of got there, I'd already intentionally eroded the framework that says that those things couldn't happen. I should probably pick one though, just for.
Well, you do. I just on a macro basis. The things we're talking about with Psi and astrology and so on, if you're coming at this, like you might be from Astroland going like, this magic thing. Dr. Dean Radin had a book out this year called Real Magic, and I'm not just saying this because I'm quoted in it several times, although I am. It's the absolute perfect primer for someone who's like, I'm theoretically open to this magic of which you speak, but he's the world's leading parapsychologist. He's done unbelievably good meta-analysis and research and so on, and it will fact you into a magical universe. So if you're looking for that goes for everyone here who's going like astro to magic. There is, and it's very conveniently timed. There is no better book to begin with than Real Magic by Dean Radin.
All right, so I'm still haven't decided.
All right, you can find us after a couple of drinks.
Yeah, I'll tell
maybe
some
it's
stories.
Like really rude or something.
I tend to be long form. It'll probably take 5 minutes to tell the story the way I want to. I mean, there's a lot of like, I did this and this crazy stuff happened. Like,
your explanation is taking 5 minutes.
I think that's just what I'm talking about.
Do we have another question at all? Oh, we got two. You guys competed. Do you want to both stand up and have a conversation about who's going to go first?
It's the same question.
Oh, okay.
So, Right. So the question is basically, so you work with wooden artwork, sculpture, carving, sanding, staining, I imagine. And so how would you turn that, or how would you approach that from a talismanic perspective? And so I would time the beginning of, like the beginning of the opera, when you first sit down to begin to shape the body of the talisman, which is the thing, the substance. But I would save the crucial moment is the Frankenstein on a lightning struck night moment, where you bring it all down, where you basically enchant, in spirit the thing, and it might not be totally done. You're not going to change things by by carving away at one point, but once you inspirit it and you cut whatever the sigils or images are into the body of the thing with the prayers, you fumigate it with the incense. You got the music going. You're dressed. You're dressed as a scribe. That moment, like the big moment, that's the key moment, and that's what you want to save that moment for the most perfect election. Like that's like the thing that only the configuration that's only going to happen twice this year. That's the moment you save that for. Start the work on something compatible, but it doesn't have to be as awesome.
If you're doing Mercury, just get a Mercury day, Mercury hour. Make sure Mercury's in shape. The other thing I did is a kind of New Guinean hermetica, where you can, depending on what it is you're actually making, it's extremely common around the world, of course, to have fetish objects that have things that are associated with the spirit in it. So get yourself a list. Like if it's planets, it's easy, but if you're actually carving your own thing from a creative perspective, that really invites inspiration from different asterisms and different stars. And you will find lists. It's a like Drink with Austin question. You will find lists that would allow you to make an artwork for, well, Owlgirl's a weird choice, but like, it depends what you want to do. You want to make Chucky, but like...
No, I really like the little hidden compartments bit.
Yeah.
Because, you can work with metal, you can work with stone, you can work with wood. Stones carry the most juice. And what I find is that when they are combined with other materials, they will offer that endless battery to the rest of the material. Like it's sort of like it's like the little Iron Man gem, right, that powers the rest of the stuff. And so if it makes sense with your design, having a little area where you can stuff a stone that's been carved.
Yeah, and that is like creatively that's quite exciting, because you can look across the world at how and just don't say you're doing like New Guinean magic or whatever, but like you can be inspired across the world and use that to reformulate how we think about these things. That's really exciting stuff. I hope you do that.
And one thing that we kind of skipped over that we're going to talk about earlier was how, in many ways, there's a very good case built by Dr. Aaron Cheek, who's here, that a lot of the talismanic protocols we see in the Picatrix have a lineage that starts with bringing a god into a statue, where you've got little compartments. The eyes are these gems. The paint made from lead, and the powder from these birds. Whatever. Like all of the components are there, and so that's almost like taking the talismanic stuff and unpacking it back into statuary.
Yeah.
Or sculpture in this case.
Very good. Do we have another question? Yes, sir?
Yeah, just leading on from that one, I also create sculptures and tools and stuff like that for ritual purposes, and I find with the creation of it, the objects become inspirited as I'm working, and I'm wondering how that ties in with the idea of calling in more energy. Is that gilding the lily, or does it...
Look, this is the animus flow model that I want us to go back to and start thinking with from a magic and astrology perspective. Really good book, very difficult to read, by a guy called Dr. Tim Ignold. It's called Life of Lines, and he's an anthropologist who spent most of his career up in the Arctic. And you have an idea of things, of persons or spirits or whatever you want, an agency moving through the world that is very much like that. You will hear that described pretty much anywhere on the planet that wasn't stupid enough to think that doesn't exist, which is everywhere but here, right? And in terms of gilding the lily, engage with it. If when you create something, or when you are the vector in which this thing now exists in the physical, see how it feels. Like, that's the next step. That's when you go, you know, from broke to woke. Bespoke is putting gems in it.
Can I just say something on that? Like, I practice a fair bit of psychometry, and I can see psychometry, like, certain levels. But I found that when you do create a painting, you're trying to stay in the positive mind frame of, like, love and light energy to download into the painting. I've never done anything with astrological timing, but when you can see the energetics inside of this art or an object, anybody, just by making something, puts that in, and it's on a different vibration that many people can't see. So when you're reading like the newspaper or the government catalog, there's vibrations that are already in there based on that person's intention to create it. And that intention, it comes down to basic psychology, which is the lowest level of vibration in the most negative thought form plane. So when you're putting in a more positive vibration on the thought form plane, which is higher, like, you know, love, positive feelings, positive energetics, rather than negatives like stress, hate, anger, frustration. You know, like, you can see that in the world a lot. Like when someone writes a newspaper article, they're under pressure by an editor, for example, and then they're putting their negative stress into that writing, and then that comes out into psychometrics, which is the vibrational scale of spirituality in an object, which is what talismans are essentially. But that exists unintentionally as well as intentionally. So when you do create something, you really have to guard your thoughts when you make something, even if you're writing a letter to a friend, because I can't explain it, but those psychometrics can come through.
Yeah, 100%, 100%, absolutely.
Yeah, in many ways, the talisman creation we're talking about is just recognizing that these things happen anyway, and then doing everything in your power to ensure that you're getting exactly this charge or this resonance. That's why, you know, you're dressed up as a thing. The music's playing, the incense is burning. You can smell only that. You can see only that. Your words are only that. And all of this is, you know, these are the scales that your intention grows as it moves.
Yep, that's aligning intention, folks.
Absolutely.
Right?
Drink time?
We have reached that time where none of us have water left, and so it's beer or wine,
wine,
and whiskey, and
also
rum.
so very much food. I was up so early chopping up a lot of cheese cubes and that kind of stuff, which is a super interesting way to get into headspace for being on stage. But yeah, so we can obviously, we've got this room, and you know, outside drinking.